I'm sure everyone is aware of the current situation in the Middle East due to the vast international media coverage, but it's difficult to understand fully what's happening on the ground when all we get is short sound bites and provocative headlines. So KuFi UK is pleased to welcome Col Richard Kemp, a respected military expert, to help explain the truth behind the headlines. Welcome, Richard. Thank
you very much, Des. It's a real pleasure, and I've worked a lot in the past with KuFi and KuFi UK, and you run a fantastic organisation. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
Oh, we're very pleased to have you, Richard. And you've been closely following the ongoing crisis in the Middle East for many years. And the media is telling us this all started because Israel was evicting Palestinians from their homes. And now we know this is a misrepresentation. We want to hear your view on what started this most recent conflict.
Yeah, I mean, the story of what was, I believe, the eviction of 4 Palestinians from homes in Jerusalem, because the homes did not belong to them, they belonged to Israelis, and they had refused to pay the rent. And I think in any country, you know, refusal to pay rent over many years is followed by eviction usually. But of course, that was used, and many in the media have reported that as being the cause of the current crisis, which of course it wasn't. It didn't have any bearing on it really. That was part of the disorder stirred up by that was part of large-scale unrest in Jerusalem, which again we've seen lies told about Israeli police and military invading the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which of course they didn't do. They had to deal with serious disorder and rioting emanating there and elsewhere. And you know, every country in the world would have to do the same if that occurred in their capital city. But none of that really is the cause of what happened here. That part of that rioting was due to a power struggle between the Palestinian Authority, Fatah elements, and Hamas. And to exploit that power struggle and that rioting, Hamas launched what is now over 3,000 rockets into Israeli civilian population centers in order to proclaim themselves to be the defenders of Jerusalem. Of course, it's not the case, and we can talk as we go on about other factors relating to this, but a key factor, I believe, is the Iranian influence. And of course, Iran has provided huge amounts of the munitions, including some advanced rockets that Hamas have been firing at Israel. And it's in Iran's interest to stir up this situation. Hamas is, of course, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza are, of course, proxies of Iran and very often act at their behest.
Absolutely. And of course, there has been some rocket attack from the north as well, hasn't there?
There have been some rockets fired from Lebanon and from Syria. My understanding, for the last I heard of it, was that none of those actually hit Israeli territory. Whether they malfunctioned or whether they were shot down before they could, I don't know. But I gather they haven't. And at the same time, we've seen serious violent disorder within Israel by Israeli Arabs who've stirred up, who've essentially risen up in some parts of Israel against the Jews. And that again is part of Hamas's orchestrated campaign against Israel. We've seen numerous conflicts, 4 specific conflicts involving Gaza in the past. Not for 20 years have we seen this kind of uprising among Israeli Arabs. And it was deliberately stirred up by Hamas, who have over many years now have infiltrated those populations. And part of their rationale for doing that was that some of the more moderate Israeli Arabs were pondering joining the mainstream Israeli government, either in coalition with Netanyahu or with Bennett. And that, of course, is complete anathema to Hamas and to the more extreme Israeli Arabs in Israel, who are determined that shouldn't happen, and therefore it's in their interest that this trouble occurs at the same time.
Right. So we've got the sort of election situation, or lack of the elections, in the Palestinian territories. Hamas must have been sort of slightly disappointed in Abbas in his approach to taking away, after what, 14 years of a 4-year rule.
He delayed the elections by over 10 years, and he finally called elections, which many of his advisors suggested he shouldn't do. And his element of Fatah and other elements within Fatah had an arrangement which broke down, and that under that arrangement, which was also made with Hamas would have gained quite a lot of democratic mandates within the Palestinian Authority, but because of factions within Fatah, it looked as if Hamas was going to win those elections. And of course, the last thing that Abbas wanted was for that to happen, and so he cancelled elections, and in doing so blamed Israel. And that again is part of the reason why we've seen that earlier violence in Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that Hamas is a terrorist group that seeks the destruction of Israel and is committing acts of terrorism and indeed war crimes. Can you explain to those listening what Hamas are really doing?
Hamas, every rocket fired out of Gaza by Hamas is effectively a double war crime, because they fire them from within the civilian population, from densely populated civilian areas, which is illegal unless you make every effort to clear the civilians out of the area that you're going to be attacking from. That's illegal under the laws of armed conflict. And secondly, every missile is clearly, it's indiscriminate, and therefore it's aimed at civilian population centers, another war crime. So every rocket is a double war crime. Hamas are, as you rightly say, a prescribed terrorist group by many countries around the world. And the military wing of Hamas is a prescribed terrorist group here in the UK. Just so that I think listeners understand, and I'm sure most do, but to just clarify this, Hamas know they can't defeat Israel. They know they can't militarily damage the IDF. They can't overcome Israel. They know that. And for that reason, under any morality of war, if you start a war you know you can't win, that is therefore an illegal war by definition, by every moral standard, and including under the Geneva Conventions. So that's another consideration. But so why, if they know they can't win, why do they do it? The reason they do it is because they want to provoke a response from Israel. They want to force Israel to respond militarily to the rockets. Now, what country in the world could possibly not respond to 3,000 and more rockets being fired into their country? No country could tolerate that. And Britain, back in 1944, we had missiles fired at us from Germany, from France, by the Germans. And of course, our response was devastating bombardment of the missile launch sites, of the storage sites, of the factories that were made in, of the railway lines which supplied these missiles, and many other targets. So of course, any country would do that, and Israel has to. They have no choice. They've got to protect their people. And so the Hamas know that, and this is why they embed their rocket launchers in dense civilian populations. Those people who tell you that there are only densely populated areas of Gaza don't know Gaza. There are also open areas that could be used. But they want Israel to fire back. They want Israel to kill their own civilian population. They are the first army, if you could call them an army, in history that has used the deaths of their own civilian population as a weapon of war. Deeply, deeply both illegal and immoral. Yeah, that's what they want. And why do they want it? Because they want Israel to be vilified and isolated in the world. And they've been using that tactic for many, many years now. They've succeeded very, very well in that tactic, because we've seen Israel condemned with numerous resolutions in the United Nations. We've seen Israel now being investigated by the International Criminal Court. And of course, the people who are complicit in this are some of the media who distort the reality, who condemn Israel out of hand for what they're doing, which is lawful defensive activity. Equally, international organizations like the UN and the EU, some politicians around the world, academics, by condemning Israel's actions, they're strengthening Hamas's actions. And what that means is that Hamas's strategy succeeds of isolating and vilifying Israel, and there will be a next time. And that next time, those people who supported Hamas this time will have blood on their hands.
Oh, absolutely. Because I mean, Hamas, as you mentioned, has fired nearly 3,500 rockets into Israel, into the civilian areas of Israel. In response to that, obviously, Israel has done hundreds of attacks, but they're targeted attacks at terrorist infrastructure. And yet, obviously, there's been a few more casualties on the Palestinian side than there has on the Israeli side. And that brings about the media talking about disproportionate response.
I've seen media comments like that, including on the BBC, and they're disgraceful. They're wrong, and they're disgraceful. They talk about disproportionate casualties as though they'd like to see as many Jews killed in Israel as Palestinians killed in Gaza. That's really concerning in my view. Of course, Israel has a very sophisticated anti-missile system called Iron Dome, which has been responsible for destroying 90% of the rockets fired into Israel from Gaza. Now, that has saved the lives of many, many Israelis. On top of that, they have carefully designed warning systems, including apps on the phone and sirens, and shelters to go into. They've done everything they can to protect their civilian population, while Hamas has done exactly the opposite. But Iron Dome has also saved the lives of many, many civilians in the Gaza Strip. Why? Because given that Israel is not sustaining massive casualties, which it would do if it wasn't for the Iron Dome, they've been able to be much more precise, much more careful, much slower, much more deliberate in their response. In other words, careful targeting, cancelling attacks when there was a risk of disproportionate civilian casualties. That wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the Iron Dome, because if Israel was sustaining heavy casualties, essentially it would have been necessary to almost carpet bomb Gaza to stop that happening. Iron Dome means that hasn't had to happen. And Israel's targeting is very precise. They have the most extraordinary intelligence coverage of what's going on in Gaza and surveillance from above. And they know where Hamas's key military infrastructure is. And they've been carefully targeting that. They haven't been targeting any civilians. But as I mentioned before, the fact that Hamas want their own civilians to die, they make sure that buildings and sites where they're carrying out military operations from have civilians in them as well. And so Israel does everything they can to prevent those people getting killed by warning them. And, you know, we've seen many examples of phone calls being made in Arabic to Arabs in Gaza, telling them to get out of a building. It's going to be hit, get out, you've got an hour to go, get out. And not only that, where to go to be safe and how to get there. And text messages, sometimes leaflets have been dropped, radio broadcasts made to warn people to get out of certain areas before they're attacked. And ultimately, if you know, people in, let's say, a high-rise building don't get out, then Israel has developed a special munition that can be dropped onto that building, which makes a loud noise but doesn't cause damage, which is like a final warning to go. And then, generally speaking, those who haven't gone will go, unless Hamas is forcing them to stay, which they sometimes do. And ultimately, in many cases, if Israel believes that there are still lots of civilians in a building, even after these different stages of warning, then they will cancel the attack on that building. They would rather, I think, miss the opportunity to target terrorists in some circumstances than kill civilians unnecessarily.
Right. Yeah, because Israel has targeted the Hamas terror tunnel network as well, the metro as they've referred to it. From a military perspective, what was it and why was it so important to Israel to take it out?
Well, since the Gaza conflict in 2014, Hamas have been building dozens and dozens and dozens of kilometers, maybe even hundreds of kilometers of tunnels underneath Gaza in order to place command and control systems, in order to stock munitions, in order to get their fighters to move around from one place to another in Gaza without being targeted from the air. It's an extraordinary complex, and it cost, I would hate to estimate how many millions of dollars it cost to build that, but they spent that money on it. They spent international aid money on that rather than improving the lives of their own civilians by building schools, hospitals, welfare facilities, building up industry, etc. They've devoted huge amounts of money to their engine of war, and so that's been targeted extensively by the IDF in recent days. And on Thursday night, there was the most spectacular operation launched by the IDF, which I think will be studied by military tacticians for decades to come. What they did effectively is they massed Israeli tanks, artillery, and infantry on the border with Gaza to make it appear that they were going in to attack Gaza on the ground. And that's what Hamas thought was going to happen. And media, international media, reported that movement as being an imminent attack into Gaza, therefore reinforcing what the Israelis were doing, unwittingly reinforcing what the Israelis were doing. Now that triggered a huge number of Hamas fighters to get down into those tunnels. And when they got there, they were then bombed from the air because Israel knew they would go and they were ready for it. And they sent in the space of 40 minutes, they sent in 160 combat aircraft to drop bunker busting JDAM bombs onto these tunnels, which destroyed huge lengths of the tunnels and killed many fighters. And when some of the fighters emerged from those tunnels, they were then again hit from the air. It was a remarkable operation. Actually, for those of you, and I'm sure everybody listening reads the Bible, it was sort of reminiscent of Gideon's ploy in biblical times when he, facing a much bigger army, he sounded trumpets and lit torches and shouted battle cries in order to make the enemy he was fighting, the Midianites, think that they were a much bigger force, and they fled the battlefield. So it's something similar in this case for those who read the Bible. And since then, the IDF have also slammed those Hamas terror tunnels on at least, to my knowledge, 4 more large-scale raids like that. This would have been devastating for Hamas because those tunnels were the cornerstone of their defense and offensive capabilities against Israel.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I did understand that some of the buildings that were built over the top of them to protect them also fell down in there. That's where some of the civilian casualties came from.
Yeah, I mean, there were some buildings constructed over the tunnels and some collapsed. And there were civilian casualties. And throughout this conflict, there have been civilian casualties because no matter what lengths the IDF go to prevent civilian casualties, it's impossible to prevent everyone. And so there have been a tragically large number of civilian casualties. Not as many as many other armies would sustain in a similar operation, and not as many as might have occurred. But on those tunnel attacks, for example, Israel did its best to attack the tunnels at points where there would be minimal civilian casualties. So many of these tunnels run under roads, so they would bomb a road, an open road, and at the same time, from the air, monitor that road to see that there wasn't suddenly a busload of civilians coming towards the target area. They take that kind of precise steps. And if you think about it, I mean, I've been involved in large-scale military operations before. It takes a huge amount of coordination, coordinating 160 fighter planes or bombers in a small airspace in 40 minutes, dropping huge numbers of munitions. It's a military art itself. But when you add on top of that the efforts that the IDF took to try and avoid civilian casualties, it's a staggering success in my view. And speaking of casualties, I feel of everybody in this conflict, I feel above all extremely sorry for the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. They're the ones that have suffered the most and will continue to suffer the most. But they're not suffering because of what Israel's doing. They're suffering from what their own leaders, Hamas, are doing. Because unless Hamas had started this aggression, Israel would not have fired a single munition into Gaza, and not one person would have been killed, not one on either side. So tragic, yes. Unfortunately, those people who the media like to blame for it, Israel, are not to blame. The people entirely to blame are Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and their followers and supporters.
Yeah, well, obviously every civilian on either side, every civilian death is a sad thing, but the numbers are quite amazing considering the amount of rockets and the amount of attacks from Israel into the Gaza Strip. So it's, when it comes to proportional, I mean, Israel, as you say, have done everything in their power to try and protect the civilians. Hamas, on the other hand, have no regard for civilians on either side. I believe the IDF have said that a large proportion, no, sorry, not large, a proportion of the rockets fired from Gaza actually fall within Gaza itself.
Yeah, I think somewhere around 400 to 500 of Hamas's 3,500 rockets have fallen inside Gaza. And they've killed, in some cases, killed Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And then the Palestinian Ministry of Health have added those to the number of casualties that they say were caused by Israel. And of course, so many parts of the media and commentators swallow up the figures that the Ministry of Health churn out as if they're some kind of fact. The Ministry of Health in Gaza is controlled by Hamas. They are part of Hamas. Whatever they tell them to say or do, they do it. That's the reality. So, and the concept of disproportionality, which the media have accused Israel, they say it's disproportionate because not many Israelis have died and many Palestinians have died. But that's not what proportionality is about in war. Proportionality in war has a very precise meaning under the laws of armed conflict, which effectively is that if you are attacking a target which contains civilians or in which there's a risk of civilians getting killed or wounded, then you can still do so, provided that the commander who's making the decision to launch an attack judges that the number of civilians who might die in an attack is proportionate to the military gain that you are trying to make. So killing civilians is obviously got to be avoided where possible, is tragic, as you rightly said, but is unavoidable and is not a war crime, provided that the number of civilians killed is not disproportionate to your military objective. If, for example, you want you see a ration truck with civilians around it, and it's a ration truck for Hamas, and you want to wipe it out, and you know that some civilians are likely to die, then it's a judgment for the commander. But the likelihood is he will say we won't do it because yes, Hamas will go hungry if we don't let them get these rations, but many civilians will die. If, on the other hand, there's a rocket launcher which could hit an Israeli school or an Israeli population center, and there's some Palestinian civilians around it, then that would not be considered disproportionate. Obviously, it depends on the precise circumstances, but that is what proportionality means in war. It doesn't mean that both sides have to have the same number of deaths. And if you think about it, people who kind of brand Israel as being immoral or acting illegally because they have killed Palestinian civilians. What about Britain in the Second World War? We killed many German civilians, unavoidably killed them. That wasn't branded, some people would disagree, but that wasn't branded as immoral or illegal. It was a necessary evil that we had to do in order to defeat the Third Reich.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. It makes you slightly concerned if Hamas had actually won, if the elections had gone ahead and Hamas had won in the West Bank, what the situation would be there, when Hamas is quite okay about targeting civilians on both sides because it furthers their purpose.
I don't think Hamas wanted to win those elections because they don't actually want to have responsibility for controlling the West Bank. They know that they've got enough problems in Gaza as it is. They don't want that extra responsibility. But what they do want is they want to be seen to be the leaders of the Palestinian population throughout the whole area. That's what they're after. But of course, you know, one of the problems with those people who support Hamas, and I don't mean necessarily support it by running around London with Palestinian flags and shouting, you know, death to Israel or death to the Jews or whatever, but people who actually support it by branding Israel criminal and not branding Hamas criminal. Those people are working against what so many people think is the right solution in this area, which is a two-state solution. They're working against that. Whether you agree it's right or don't doesn't matter, because while Hamas holds sway over the Palestinian people, there could never be a two-state solution, never, ever. You know, Fatah and the Palestinian Authority are bad enough. They are, and they're not by any means moderate people, but at least they're people that Israel and the international community, to an extent, can work with. Hamas are not. And so the more Hamas have influence, the more powerful Hamas are, the less possible any two-state solution is.
Absolutely. And yet today at the UN, the Security Council want a resolution to try and resolve the conflict. And that resolution has been obviously blocked 3 times by the US, but there's a resolution that the UK government supports. Now, on this day, I think it was 2018, 3 years ago, you were at the UN standing up and speaking out for Israel, I seem to remember.
Yeah, when Israel was, I've spoken and taken part in emergency debates at the United Nations Human Rights Council, attempting to bring some kind of objectivity to what is essentially a cesspit of anti-Israel activity. And I've no doubt the same is already planned by the United Nations after this conflict. They've already decided Israel are the guilty party, the war criminals, and they will condemn them at the United Nations Human Rights Council. The US is right to block any resolution by the UN to end this. I think, you know, obviously everybody in their right mind wants to see an end to this conflict, but we shouldn't just be looking at this conflict. We should also look forward at the next conflict, because there will be one. There's no doubt about that. And it's very important that Israel is able to do as much damage as they think necessary to the Hamas military infrastructure now, during this conflict, as much damage as they think necessary to severely delay the next conflict breaking out. And it's only Israel that can judge when that damage has been done. It's not the United States, not Great Britain, not the UN. Nobody else can judge that. Only Israel can say when they believe that enough damage has been done. Because if enough damage is not done, both to deter Hamas in psychological terms and also to deprive them of the wherewithal to fight, if that's not done, then the next conflict will occur sooner and more people will die on both sides sooner. So in my view, yes, we all want to see it end, but no, we should not pressure Israel to end it before they feel that they've achieved the objectives they need.
So is there any sort of knowledge, understanding of how many rockets Hamas might have stockpiled over the last few years?
I don't personally know that. I mean, they've obviously, having fired something like 3,500, they've got a hell of a lot. They've probably got quite a lot more, or had, but I think many of their stockpiles have been destroyed by Israel so far. They will still have some, but they don't have an endless supply. And you know, I mentioned earlier that where does their supply come from? It comes from Iran, and Iran will work hard to resupply them. And it's not, Iran do supply missiles, but they also supply the wherewithal for Hamas to manufacture their own missiles inside Gaza. And that will be done again. They will be working very hard after this to resupply. Now, of course, Israel and its allies will work hard to stop that resupply taking place. But it is going to happen. It's despite the so-called blockade of Gaza, no blockade can be perfect or without any holes in it, and so it will happen. An answer to your question, I really don't know how many. I don't know if anybody knows how many stocks of missiles Hamas have, but they have enough to continue this themselves for a bit longer.
Right. Okay. So, what's your take on the media bias surrounding the conflict? Then the way the media tends to be downplaying the terrorism of Hamas.
But I don't say all media do, because of course there are notable exceptions. Unfortunately, that doesn't include the BBC or Sky News over here. But there are notable exceptions in the press here and in different media outlets around the world. But overall, the media have gotten what I would class as an anti-Israel agenda, which is the result of decades and decades of propaganda pushed out by Hamas, by others in the Palestinian world, and before in the Arab world as well, to blacken Israel's name and to distort the reality of the political situation over Israel and Palestinians, and that propaganda has had huge effect. There's been huge amounts of money spent on it. It's what I consider to be the greatest slur campaign in the history of the world. And it's been taken up not just by the media, but in universities, where you'll find academics, professors in schools and universities who push forward this Hamas agenda onto their students, who then themselves believe it, because there's not much coming out of the media to counter it. And for example, I spoke recently to a student who I sent her an article that I'd written, which she read, and she said it was the first time she's actually seen it explained in a way that made her question her understanding of the situation. And unfortunately, this situation is going to get worse as future generations who've been indoctrinated with anti-Israel propaganda and have it shoved down their throat every time they turn the television on or look at social media. Unfortunately, there's going to be more and more of them and fewer of the people who actually do understand. And it is, to be fair to students in particular, it is extremely difficult to understand it. Even Jewish students who at schools and universities who probably have a greater interest than the average person in what's going on in Israel, even for them, it's extremely hard to understand because the situation is so complicated and changes daily. And so, if you're fed an agenda which gives pretty black and white damnation of Israel, it's very, very hard. And many people who comment on these issues and post on social media, if you showed them a map and asked them to show me where Israel is on the map, they wouldn't find it. They haven't got a clue. They just churn out and parrot the propaganda. In some of the recent demonstrations in London, I've seen, and elsewhere in the UK, I've seen people flying Palestinian flags. And they're so in love with the Palestinians and with Hamas that they fly them upside down because they don't know which way up they should go. Yeah. In many cases. It just shows, I think, just illustrates the ignorance and lack of understanding of so many people in this country, which is a tragedy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why we're so pleased to have you on today, Richard, because you're giving a perspective, the truth, and the information that people really need to make an informed decision. I mean, we had someone on our social media platform only the other day saying, thank you for highlighting this. I've always been sorry for the Palestinians, so I've always supported them. But now that I see what's really going on behind the scenes, I can't sort of continue to support them in that way. I mean, clearly, we're all sorry for the Palestinian civilians who are under the oppression of Hamas and what's going on there. But you clearly can't support a cause which is to wipe out another nation, which is exactly what Hamas is about.
I couldn't agree more, Des, with that. I think I have, as I mentioned before, I have the greatest possible sympathy for the Palestinian civilians who have suffered and died in this conflict. I think very few people wouldn't have that sort of sympathy, and you couldn't really not. But we should never forget where the blame for this lies. It lies with the Hamas leaders who are in a constant state of aggression. They do not accept the right of Israel to exist. And the same with the Palestinian Authority, although they don't declare it so openly, and they don't go about trying to achieve it in quite the same way. But they do believe there should not be a two-state solution. They believe there should be one state, and that is an Arab state in what is the land of Israel. And it's their malice, and for religious reasons, and it is religiously motivated. For religious reasons, they won't tolerate a Jewish state in what they consider their land, or wrongly consider their land, by the way.
Yeah.
But they have consigned their civilian population to this misery. If they were prepared to be at peace with Israel, the West Bank and Gaza would have the most remarkable prosperity, in my opinion, because Israel, which only wants to, obviously there are exceptions, but the majority of Israelis and the Israeli government only want to live in peace with the Palestinian neighbors. And so they would do their utmost to provide funding, to provide technology, to encourage businesses. And Gaza could be a kind of almost a paradise on the Mediterranean if that was permitted. But of course, that's not what their leadership want.
No, sadly not. And it's a shame in a way that so much of the media doesn't seem to realize the underlying strategy. Hamas, it's clearly within their articles that they want to destroy Israel. And that's what they're focused on doing. And this latest wave, unfortunately, is just more of the same, isn't it?
Absolutely, that's their sole objective. They don't recognize the right of Jews to be living in that land, or at least if they are living in that land, they shouldn't be self-governing. The territory should be governed by Arabs and Arabs only. And as I mentioned, it is religiously motivated. People pretend it's not a religious war. It is a religious war. The reason people pretend in Europe that it's not a religious war is because they can't comprehend it, because religion, effectively, Christian religion in particular, is dying in Europe. And so many people in the media, in universities, etc., reject religion and can't see how religion could play a role. Yet it is entirely religiously motivated, with roots going back generations. Those people who blame the settlements, so-called, in the West Bank for this conflict, and many people do blame those settlements. What is their explanation? If those settlements, which didn't exist before 1967, if those settlements are responsible for this aggression, then what was responsible for the aggression against Jews in that same land in the 1930s, in the 1940s, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, before 1967, when there were no settlements? It's all about a strong view among many Arabs and Arab leaders that Jews should not be owning their own country in the Middle East. Unfortunately, we've seen a very, very impressive change of direction from Arab countries in the form of the Abraham Accords that have been developed over the last few years and come to fruition in the last year. Because the Arab governments in countries, including Saudi Arabia, which hasn't yet signed up to the Abraham Accords, but is definitely in favor of them, recognize that Israel is not their enemy now. Their enemy is Iran. And they know that there's only one country, probably in the world, but certainly in the Middle East, which will help them protect themselves from Iran, which is Israel. And so we've seen a massive realignment in a way in the Middle East. It was going on before, but has been accelerated under the Abraham Accords, which has caused Arab governments to take a completely different approach. You mentioned before that Britain signed up. Britain is behind it certainly wishes the resolution of the UN to end the conflict. In other words, to prevent Israel from doing what it needs to do. The Foreign Office in this country, unfortunately, is behind the curve. They don't recognize. They do recognize, but they haven't really, I suppose, internalized the change in the Arab world. Their attitude towards Israel, which has been negative for many, many years, is due to their perception of how the Arabs feel about Israel, because their primary concern has been oil interests in the Middle East, which of course is controlled by Arabs. Well, you know, at some point, maybe in this century, the Foreign Office might come up to date and recognize that the Arab world has changed in that respect, in respect of Israel.
No, I agree. The Foreign Office policy probably dates back to the 1940s. And things have definitely moved on. That said, our government has spoken out with Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism, hasn't it, in recent days?
I think our government has, but very limply, in my view. They haven't condemned Israel, but they haven't given Israel the support it should be getting. For example, Germany was very strong in its support. The United States has been, Australia has been, other countries have been, but Britain has not been. It hasn't kind of turned on Israel, but we above all in this country have great interest in Israel, and for numerous reasons, one of which is because it was as a result of the Balfour Declaration in 1917 that Israel eventually came into, or came again into existence. And it was also as a result of thousands and thousands and thousands of British soldiers dying in battle in that land to throw out the Ottoman Empire. Those two things really were critical in the eventual re-establishment of the State of Israel. But coming more up to date now, I worked for several years in British intelligence, at the top level of British intelligence, working in the Cabinet Office. And I saw firsthand how much intelligence value we got from Israel. And I've known about it also ever since, when Israel provides intelligence that has saved many British lives, not just in battle, but meant the lives of many British people on the streets of London and elsewhere in this country. For example, I think it was in 2015 or 16, there was an Iranian bomb factory discovered in London and disrupted by the Metropolitan Police and the security service. And the intelligence on that came from Israel. Had they not provided that intelligence, every likelihood that bomb factory would have continued, and then there would have been significant bomb attacks in London by Iran. And that's just one of many, many examples of the way we benefit from Israeli intelligence. We also benefit from Israeli battlefield medical technology. Soldiers' lives have been saved by Israeli battlefield medical technology in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. Israeli other military technology, which has helped prevent bombs going off. And all of that is before we even talk about the trade benefit and various other cultural benefits we get from Israel. So we are, Israel is a Western liberal democracy. We have a duty we have in this country to stand by Israel and to condemn those who want to see Israel destroyed.
Absolutely. Yeah, we seem to be their close friends behind closed doors, don't we? Unfortunately, our government and our Foreign Office rarely speak out on their behalf. But when you hear the rhetoric, it sounds like we're the greatest of friends.
I think
they need to show it a bit more, don't they?
Sorry?
They need to show it a bit more, I think.
Well, I think it is a complex situation, and for example, when we were members of the EU, we were less anti-Israel, I suppose, than most other EU countries and the EU itself. And we would use our influence in the EU to moderate EU bloc votes, because EU countries tend to vote alike on foreign policy issues as far as they can in the United Nations. And we were therefore, I think, an influence for good in the UN. And we've had since then, we've had some good foreign policy initiatives. For example, Boris Johnson condemned the International Criminal Court for its investigation of Israel, which is essentially it's a sham. It's without justification, and it's not really lawful under international law either. Boris Johnson did condemn that, albeit belatedly. And of course, I mean, the government has many other things to worry about than Israel. But I don't think it's right that we should not given a sufficient priority to Israel to be able to understand the reality and to come down on the right side every time.
No, I agree. So from our KuFi supporters' point of view, who are listening in, what do you commend them to do in these current times?
I would say that, first of all, to keep abreast of what's happening, to look at it in more depth, to not believe the headlines you see in the media, but to read into it in more depth than that, so that you have a better understanding of the reality. And then, and if you already understand it, fine, you don't need to go through that stage. But then I would argue to lobby your MPs, to write to your MPs, asking them to do the right thing over Israel. Where you have influence with other decision makers in this country, then the same applies. And where you have the opportunity to influence the media, even if it's just local media, even if it's just social media, I think that's those are important contributions that KuFi supporters could make. KuFi is a very important organization for Israel. It's one of the staunchest pro-Israel organizations in the world. And I think that the combined might of KuFi could be used to good effect in all those areas I've spoken of. But one thing I have noticed during this last few days since this conflict began is social media, and particularly Twitter, is overwhelmed by anti-Israel propaganda.
Yeah.
And again, I do my best on social media from my Twitter account, which is at Col Richard Kemp. I do my best to speak the truth about what's happening and to try and bring the reality to people's attention. But of course, I'm only one voice. There are plenty of other people doing the same, but not enough. We are actually overwhelmed on Twitter. My Twitter feed is jam-packed with anti-Israel propaganda every single day, far more than any previous conflicts. They've clearly got their act together, and I think we need to get our act together. So I would urge KuFi supporters to essentially to do what you can with your MPs, mainstream media and social media.
Yeah, well, we do have a campaign running at the moment, writing to our MPs and the Prime Minister, encouraging them to support Israel and help bring a sensible resolution and end to the conflict. So we'll post the information so that people can actually do that if they haven't done already.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to follow my Twitter account or my account on Twitter and either support or add comment to the things that I'm saying, then I would urge you to do that as well. And there are plenty. If you look, looking around Twitter, there are quite a few accounts which are actually saying the right thing about Israel, and they all need support.
Absolutely, and I agree with that. I mean, we have obviously a large social media following, but we've been hammered in a sense by those who are pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, and quite a bit of anti-Semitism comes out there. But actually, the more people who speak out in favor of Israel and in her cause will actually change the dynamic. So I definitely encourage people to follow Richard's. In fact, I've done that myself in recent days. You've been a great source of great material, and I really appreciate that. And we're really pleased that you were able to join us today. And thank you for all your comments, Richard.
Thank you. I might, if I've got time, I might say a word about the Jews. Actually, you mentioned something there, the Jews in this country.
Yes, please.
We saw only on Sunday, we saw a cavalcade of cars waving Palestinian flags, driving through areas of North London where there are large Jewish populations, with people shouting out instructions to rape Jews, and particularly rape their daughters. And I understand that 4 arrests have been made as a result of that. But that is a devastating thing to happen in London in 2021. We've seen also other mass demonstrations. These demonstrations are organized by groups that they're not really interested in the Palestinian situation. What they want is they want to target Jews in this country. They want to make Jews scared. They want to shut Jews up. They want to drive Jews out. So again, in addition to the suggestions I made earlier, anything you can do as good Christians to support your Jewish brothers and sisters, then in any way, then please do so, because hopefully there will be a ceasefire before long, but until that happens, this situation is likely to get worse. I think even, again, on Sunday, I think it was, we saw reports of a rabbi beaten up in Chigwell, outside London. And there have no doubt been other attacks taking place. So, you know, I think all of us Christians and even non-Christian decent people have a duty to do what we can to stand alongside our Jewish brothers and sisters.
Yeah, well, amen to that. And we certainly are doing that at KuFi, and we'll, you know, happily support our Jewish communities at this time. It's a difficult time for them, and we sort of stand with them, and we certainly pray for them, and we continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. It's certainly needed at this time. So thank you once again, Richard.
Thank you. My pleasure, Des.
Thank you.
Keep up your good work on you and KuFi.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye.